Hello, everyone, and welcome. You are listening and watching simultaneously Silicon Curtain and Rashkin Report. So, congratulations. Let's celebrate. Press, hit like, and subscribe because it's me, Yuri Rashkin, and we are here weekly with Jonathan Fink of Silicon Curtain trying to figure out what's going on. And I just realized, Jonathan, that I called the podcast on my end the Russian threat, and it's like the RT. It's the RT podcast. Nice job, Yuri.
Yes,
How's
there's
it going,
RT.
Jonathan?
There's a subliminal message in there.
Yes, and I tried to do a stream on my channel called Rashkin today. People just freaked out because they're like, "No, it's too close." So okay, fine.
Rashkin today. Yeah, that's nicely ironic, though. I like that.
Well,
did you see the RT office in Tehran got flattened there?
I did not.
It did, yeah. I mean, I wonder whether that was accidental. I guess not. I think that was maybe intentional.
So share. You are working. You are on the road, and it's incredible that you are continuing to. You are in Ukraine, I think, almost more than you are in Great Britain these days. Like how are you doing?
It feels that way. We did a live stream this evening from a cafe in Padil, and I just thought, well, this is crazy. I seem to spend more time in here than my local pub. In fact, I do. And of course, the cakes are better. Here I have. For later, to treat myself after this live stream, I have a lovely
Perfect
creamy banana flaky pastry thing.
Oh, yes. Well, that sounds delicious. And anything you can say, frankly, about life in Kyiv at these days?
We haven't had a single air alarm since I arrived. That's the first time in Ukraine. Not a single one, and I've been here 4 days, or since Tuesday. So that's unusual. There have been really no drones over Kyiv the entire week. We actually went out to film drone interception, and of course there were no drones to intercept. So I can't say it's a disappointment because I don't want drones flying over people's heads. But at the same time, when you go out to film drone interception, it's a little bit of a letdown when there are no drones to intercept. But that it is what it is. Hey, damn Russians! They don't send the stuff over when you need it. It's only when you don't want it.
That's incredible, Jonathan. That is just really a huge piece of news, I think, right there. That there's been no drone attacks in 4 days. And that really makes
this is Kyiv, of course. I mean, that doesn't apply to the whole of Ukraine, but it was quiet yesterday. We were at this say drone interception, and they had this extraordinary map right in the middle of a field, in the middle of nowhere, and they actually have a monitoring feed from their what do you call it, battlefield management system, and you could see the whole of Kursk, Belgorod, and the eastern part of Russia, or the western part of Russia. And the whole of eastern Ukraine, you could see everything, and you got strategic bomber bringing cabs over to Sumy. You got a reconnaissance thing. You got an Orlan over here. Literally, all the little drones and planes are tagged. You know exactly what's moving everywhere. It's kind of terrifying, but it's also incredibly impressive what they can achieve there. But the guy we were with, he said, "Look, this is the quietest night of the year so far. I've never seen the map this empty. Usually there's stuff, flying all over the place." He said it's remarkably quiet. What that map doesn't show, of course, is the Ukrainian outgoing drones. So we don't necessarily know what is going the other way. But that's
what
good
is
news.
How do people in Kyiv explain this?
I'm sure they do. They just, what they also know is that when there's a let up, it means that Russia is stockpiling for something. So it's not necessarily, oh, great, they've stopped or run out. It's, okay, well, let's enjoy the pause while it lasts because we know it'll start and it'll be timed with something typically strategic. So, I also think the sort of performative terror of their operations, they know it's not going to get any traction while Iran is at its peak. They're not going to make it into the media. They're not really going to cut through. The temperature also has changed dramatically. 1st of March, it's got dramatically warmer here. I mean, it's hovering around 0 degrees at night, but it was really quite warm today. You even have people on the street like babushkas kind of hosing away all the sand and stuff that's been used as grit. They're starting to clean the streets. There's a definite feeling that the harshest winter in decades is suddenly over, and that the immediate existential crisis of the energy infrastructure is past for now. And if Russia was to continue, striking, it's really not going to have, that much effect from this point on. So, you do feel that they've turned a corner and survived the harshest winter of the war, the harshest winter of the last couple of decades, and I think there's a palpable sense of relief in that.
That's remarkable, and hopefully this is somehow actually meaning good news, not stockpiling news, but good news. Perhaps this is somehow connected with Iran. This is, or is it too soon? Because we're looking at, I think, gas prices and going, wow, that's is that connected to Iran, or is that too soon? Because they kind of jumped up.
Jumped up, and if I was being super cynical, I would say, okay, the Kremlin on the one hand are looking at their strategic ally Iran and going, yeah, that's bad. Wish we could help you. On the other hand, they're looking at the oil prices going, this isn't necessarily all bad news for the Kremlin. I mean, there are some economists who suggest that Russia is not really going to necessarily reap the full benefits of rising oil prices because of their huge supply chain costs and increasing pressure on their grey fleet. But rise in Brent crude, rise in Urals crude has to be the glimmer of good news for Putin, at least, because that eases maybe the immediate financial catastrophe which his budget was facing.
What about the weapons that supposedly now Ukraine is never going to get because the United States is using them up in Persian Gulf, and the line is now to get them is forever?
Yeah, the weapons they were never going to get anyway, and all the weapons that Caroline Leavitt was talking about, we gave all our best weapons to Ukraine, and now we don't have any weapons left. The fact is,
I predicted this the first day that the war started. I was like, yep, now they're going to blame Ukraine that they don't have enough.
It's all Ukraine's fault. But the fact is, they didn't send all of their weapons. They didn't certainly send their best weapons. And actually, a huge chunk of the Biden funds were actually to replenish stocks. As we know, they cleaned out a lot of their near end-of-life equipment. Tons and tons of end-of-life equipment and missiles near or over the expiry dates. And the huge chunk of the so-called Ukraine funding was used to replenish US stocks with modern, shiny stuff. So Trump, of course, is disingenuous on multiple levels here. One, by saying Ukraine got all the good stuff. Well, they didn't. Secondly, by saying that Biden, didn't, left the cupboards bare. Absolute nonsense, of course. Now, it may be that supply chain processes are incredibly slow. It may be that the mandated stuff hasn't arrived or been necessarily produced on time. But he's mendacious on multiple levels with this kind of stuff. And then they have the absolute audacity to insult Zelensky on the one hand. In a tweet earlier this week, he referred to him as P.T. Barnum, which in this context is clearly meant as a slur. And just a few days later,
I mean, maybe they're praising his showman skills.
Yeah, I think not. No, I mean, no. I suspect not. I know. He's basically, I think, implying that Zelensky is a grifter and implying that he's a snake oil salesman. Ultimate in projection, of course. And then they have the absolute temerity to turn around and say, "Oh, Ukraine, could you please share your drone interception technology with us, please? Because we realized we launched this war against Iran, and we actually don't have a solution against Shaheeds."
Here's my thought. I think that Zelensky should call Trump and say, "Hey, we got some drones here for you, but we just want you to do us a favor. There's a small favor. We got some,
Yes,
tomahawks.
this guy giving us trouble. Can you
Right. Because
can
it's,
you just,
that's how
take him
Trump got
out?
into trouble with the first impeachment, is that he was told Zelensky that we just want you to do us a favor
Yeah.
and find some dirt on Biden. So now I think it's Zelensky's turn to say,
It is.
hey, we just like some tomahawks. My strategy is 500 tomahawks and 2 weeks, and Putin will sit at negotiation table.
What I love is if Zelensky put on a little kind of flat cap, dressed as a kind of Odessa Gopnik while he was, trying to negotiate the deal. I think that would be fun.
Well, I think that's the language that our president understands. I think he's been often compared to Zhirinovsky, who has been a famous Russian politician, con artist, and I think that for a good reason. Now he has surrounded himself with people who are, I can't say equally inept, because it's really kind of hard to judge at that level of ineptness who is equally or greater inept than anybody else. But his cabinet. And so today we have first the winner of I'm sure somebody put lots of money on it at just the right time and they won. But Kristi Noem is no longer Secretary of Homeland. Our homeland can breathe a sigh of relief because Kristi Noem is no longer
worse. Gets appointed to the role. Yeah.
And of course, he already found somebody else to put in her place because, from what reporting is, Kristi Noem was fired not because, I don't know, not killing a dog, not Americans killed in Minneapolis. No, because she claimed that Trump gave her approval and supported her and endorsed her in her policies, in her spendings, and a couple of different things that she was asked about. Trump did not care for that at all. And so apparently that crossed the line. That was the straw that broke our orange camel's back.
And she did under oath. Yeah. I guess she didn't want to implicate herself in some kind of perjury or
well, that's not how it works over, where are her priorities?
She's not that smart.
Yeah, and now, it's interesting that the rumor mill was quickly proven to be true, is that Senator Markwayne Mullin from Oklahoma is now going to be the next Secretary of Homeland Security. And to his, whether he liked it or not, but he's a Republican from Oklahoma, and they have a ton of those. So finding another Republican in his place is not a problem. But like, for instance, in Texas, there's this fantastic candidate who is running to be a senator. It's a Democrat, might actually win, James Tallarico. And there's thoughts that he might run for president after that if everything goes well. But then they go, they found a Democrat who won in Texas, keep him there. That's really rare that you find that. But Markwayne Mullin, a Republican in Oklahoma, there's a bunch of them. So he's got, like, I think, ultimate fighter kind of credentials, and he's a owner of a truck driving company who pulled himself out by his own bootstraps, kind of a character, and is always ready for a fight. There's been a Senate hearing between him and a union leader where they almost got into a physical altercation. So that's going to be the new secretary.
That sounds fun. That sounds great.
Thanks. The United States of America. Yes, we have fun however we can.
I mean, we've got our own clowns and grifters. It's all very well to point the finger, but we have a tremendous bunch of idiots, many of who came out of the woodwork during Brexit and proved themselves to be not just inept, but massively disingenuous as well.
How are they doing these days? How are their political perspectives these days?
It's kind of interesting. I mean, to be fair, there are some people who are pretty smart and who went for it for non-grifting reasons. I'm not going to say all of them are grifters and racists, but there's enough. There are absolutely enough of the other type. They just, grifters are going to grift. They'll find something else, or they keep hammering away at the lies. It doesn't really affect them because they're not aligned to reality. They're just aligned to their own ego or their own opportunities. What was I going to say? My favorite, of course, is Howard Nutlick, who is quite a character. Oh my God.
Yes, and I will say that my last thought for Kristi Noem is that there's a possibility that she might end up being a senator now, because there was some word a few weeks ago that she was thinking about running for senator if this secretary gig wasn't going to work out. Because in South Dakota, where she used to be a governor, there's an election, and there's a very nervous Republican senator who is terrified that Kristi Noem might be interested. I think she might be interested, and
No.
who knows? She's got time on her hands now.
The one that I find absolutely fascinating is Marjorie Taylor Greene,
Indeed,
who was the worst, absolutely the worst of the worst when she was a full-on MAGA fanatic. Well, she still is a MAGA fanatic. She's just claiming that Trump is no longer MAGA, I guess. But at the point where she split from Trump on certain subjects, she's speaking absolute vicious truth to power in a way that I could kind of align with. But as it's been pointed out to me, that doesn't suddenly mean she's pro-Ukraine. That doesn't mean she's suddenly pro-reality or has developed, an actual moral framework. But her transformation is maybe one of the most fascinating.
it is, because she started out as somebody who was and was for a long time. She made a career on being the most fervent, ardent supporter of Trump in Congress, wearing the red hat at State of the Union speech.
QAnon, she was major kind of QAnon head.
She was QAnon. She was everything. She was certifiably certifiable. And then it turned out that she did not like a couple of things that started with the Epstein file. And then she didn't like the interventionist policies. And for her, this all lined up into kind of, in a way, continue to QAnon, which in a way maybe shows that the world shifted and she hasn't. Because she believed in QAnon, that there is this conspiracy of people who have lots of power, who do horrible things and rule the world. Well, after the Epstein case, turned out that there is some basis to that, except it's not the people that maybe she was hoping she was going to find. And so, but now, like, she seems more reasonable because of the information that has come to light. But it doesn't mean that her solutions, her idea is that United States president should just park his plane somewhere and he should be in the United States, which, is not a reasonable solution to anything. But she just feels like, based on those couple of things, it's also something that I find fascinating, that in the Republican Party these days, women's rights are represented by their most fringe elements. Because women's rights is something that people that are on the way out or outdo, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Nancy Mace or Lauren Boebert. It's all of a sudden you just go, these are the craziest Republicans, and they are the ones concerned. Because I think in the Republican Party, women's rights is just something that is viewed as very weird and crazy out there on a fringe that marginal people do. So
is that because they actually believe in that, or is it that they realize that their core support is very much aligned with a kind of evangelist, kind of extreme evangelical nationalism?
Well, I don't know what they really believe, but their actions seem to indicate that they do things there that are supported by their religious allies. And Project 2025 has pretty clearly outlined some of the things they're trying to accomplish. SAVE Act right now that they're trying to pass is going to literally make it harder for women to vote, because it's going to raise requirements to such that many married women may need to re-register, obtain new paperwork, etc. And it actually might hit Republican base harder than Democratic base, because Democratic base tends to be higher educated, better informed, and have documentation, including passports and things like that, which makes actually the process not that difficult for them. But this is just a process where I think that The all the things that we were warned about in Handmaid's Tale, that Americans were told about, and the series was made, and like this was all right there, and we went, "Wow, fascinating," and voted for people who are trying to make this a reality show instead of something different, instead of art. Which is all the more reminder that art has its place, but not in preventing anything or stopping cultural atrocities or genocides or anything. Yeah. It just kind of makes us more aware of it as it's happening.
Or, I mean, as having this debate with a tremendous guy from California who is now in the armed forces of Ukraine. It's what I love to see is hippie engineers in military uniform fighting tyranny. I mean, that's quite inspiring. We were arguing whether Handmaid's Tale was a better representation of what's happening or Alex Garland's Civil War. And I think his conclusion was that Civil War actually is the greater fantasy piece, because at least in that you have a threshold of states and people who are prepared to rise up to reimpose democracy. And he said, yeah, that ain't going to happen because you do not have a threshold of people who are going to stand up and necessarily resist the encroaching, attempt to build an authoritarian theocracy.
I'm really glad to hear that, honestly, because I had the same opinion, and I wasn't sure if I was the only one. In a sense, that Civil War, the movie, seemed to me very unrealistic. It almost seemed like a liberal's nightmare. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen, because all of that, it just seemed like it didn't make sense. The only scene that I think made sense to most people as probably realistic is when a person gets shot because he's the wrong kind of an American.
This is the guy with the sunglasses and the pit.
Yeah, exactly. When he is born in Hong Kong.
Scene, yeah.
Right. And that's the part. But I think otherwise it does seem like if we are going to go down that path, continue going down that path, then it's more of a darkness just swallowing the whole thing versus somebody standing up. Right now we're seeing, I guess right now we're still at a stage where people that are looking to be leaders in this and looking to make careers in being leaders against Trump are counting on elections. There's Congress, Senate, governors, president, for crying out loud. And if that feels like it has opportunity to create change, then I think that there's a chance. But if people feel like the elections are not allowed, integrity of elections is violated, Trump has already done lots of things, it's hard to imagine in the end where is this resistance on the level of civil war is going to come from. That's just doesn't make any sense in today's America. It's more likely that there will be CBS News and there will be CNN. They will just broadcast kind of slightly very different information, but there will still be the same logo, the same music, maybe even many of the same anchors, but it will just gradually change, and reality is going to, TV is going to try to do what it's doing in Russia, which is prove to us that don't look in the fridge. The fridge is not, don't look over there. Don't trust, don't believe your lying eyes. And it, fascinating to me that people wonder why Trump hasn't said really much of anything about explaining the war.
Well, this is the interesting thing. I mean, it seems to me that it's Putin's early years which are the better model for what's happening, because actually it's not necessarily the case that there's going to be a massive economic collapse or a huge decline in living standards. And the early Putin years did actually bring with it a tremendous, it didn't bring an improvement of corruption and so on, but it brought a tremendous economic boost. And you just have to
look at it, or was it because there was 9/11?
I'm not sure that had anything to do with it.
Because it seemed to me that this is where we reoriented ourselves and said that if you're either with us or you're with terrorists, and Russia is great and the prices on oil, and I mean the war
the
for
price of
oil.
oil went up. Yeah, so that indirectly helps because the price of oil, the fortunes of the Russian state and the fall of the Soviet state obviously are intimately linked with the price of oil.
Greatly improved.
But what you had, I think, with early Putin is that he basically said to people, right, you're gonna surrender. The deal is you surrender your democratic process and your agency, and I will eliminate the chaos because I will become the left and the right and the center. Not everyone, I think, directly understood it, but what they saw was gradually the sort of chaos, insanity, and mafia violence that every day created that sense of utter disorder. That went underground. The corruption didn't disappear, but it was basically you're no longer going to have these struggles in plain sight. We're going to tidy it away, just like they tidied away all the bombs during the Olympic Games. Out of sight, out of mind. Same as the Soviet Union. Anyone with mental illnesses, anyone with disabilities, we're going to take that out of your line of sight. You're going to suddenly have the sense that some sense of order has returned. But if you look at the life expectancy figures, they crashed in the 1990s, absolutely crashed. And when the alcohol laws were liberalized and they had the financial crisis, that combination of inebriation and an absolute collapse of the Soviet welfare state led to a huge drop in mortality, average age and mortality, especially for men. And then from the early 2000s through to 2014, I think pretty much, you saw dramatic increases in life expectancy in Russia. So that's the untold story of Putin. He abolished democracy, but he also abolished some of the chaos. And it allowed a certain.
But also, if we just imagine that there's more wealth flowing into Russia, and Russia
average
is much
income
more
went up hugely. Yeah,
right.
not
And
for
we also
everyone
do
in
have this the trickle down economy where the oil revenue is enough to sustain Moscow.
It is. And you allow a sort of, they introduced certain market reforms. They introduced a far more rational tax system. And I'm not justifying Putin, but he had some very competent economists before they cleared out, most of the more liberal-minded economists. They really cleaned up the tax system. They lowered the lower end of tax right down. And okay, they didn't liberalize to the extent of becoming a full market economy or reducing nepotism and corruption. Their economy could have grown 10 times more than it actually did. But it liberalized a certain segment of the free market to allow a little layer of private enterprise to flourish. And the average wages, especially for middle managers and stuff, rocketed, and that trickled down to life expectancy. So that's
but again,
notable.
it's the same thing where a dictatorship or authoritarian state experiences this kind of an uptick, and even unlike the Persian Gulf states, which looked at Iran and invested but also invested in the wealth of their own states, but Russia invested, I guess, in its own army, and Russian life in Russia outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg really didn't improve much.
I think it got worse. I mean, I actually think that it really deteriorated. I mean, I went to various provincial places through the 90s, some of which were really sort of quite grim. But ironically, I went to somewhere like Vorkuta, where it wasn't great. People weren't being paid wages, etc. And this was in 1998, and I had a fun trip to Vorkuta, as you do.
The fun trip, Vorkuta.
Yeah, I don't think I've told you before. My honeymoon was in Vorkuta.
I mean, I guess if you want to be together for warmth, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, it was, but it's a story for a different thing. It's sort of inappropriate to tell sort of fun anecdotes about visiting Russia's far north.
We'll save it for the premium adult podcast, After Dark, Silicon Curtain After Dark.
Yes. John and Yuri unscripted, live and unleashed.
That's premium content.
That's right. We'll put a 21 age gate over that one.
Right. And
But
then there will be nobody there, but at least we'll know.
but this is going to sound kind of weird. Vorkuta, the streets were pretty clean compared to St. Petersburg and Moscow in 1998. The shops looked very Soviet, but they had stuff in them and nice cakes and whatever. And you had these neon signs on top of the buildings like Slava Trudeau and stuff. You still had the communist slogans in giant neon on top of apartment blocks. Very few adverts, clean streets, reasonably well-stocked shops, transport that was kind of more or less working, and the town wasn't falling apart. It looked reasonably well maintained. You fast forward to the travelogues of Ilya Varlamov before he was kicked out, of the 2018, I think 2017, I think he recorded it. And there, just 20 years later, you're looking at something which is already post-apocalyptic, like whole swathes of the town abandoned. And you actually had blocks that would just catch fire and no one would bother putting it out because no one except a few tramps lived there anymore. And then all these entire neighborhoods have been cut off for water and gas. I mean, the whole place just turned into a like Pripyat or something, like a post-apocalyptic landscape. And I think that's Putin's Russia. All the wealth flowed to a few small urban centers, such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, maybe Nizhny, and everywhere else is just kind of starved of resource.
It's really what I find fascinating to me, I guess. I feel like I'm overusing this word, so I'll have to expand my vocabulary. That you have Soviet Union that's is like living off of the Russian Empire that accumulated from art to art, everything. And now you have the new modern Russia living off of the dead body of Soviet Union and all of the things that were created then, any infrastructure for people. This is just degradation.
It's an entirely parasitical entity, but it generated enough wealth and comfort in the large urban centers to keep that architecture going, and crucially to pay for the intelligence services and Rosgvardia to protect the Tsar and to protect let's say, the roots of extraction and distribution of the wealth that kept the elite going. That's all it's ever been. I mean, that's all it's ever been from Ivan the Terrible onwards is an extractive mechanism, very much inherited from the Mongol horde, which is you control trade routes by force and resources by force. And as long as you control, the army and the intelligence services and you're brutal enough, well, that's all you need to do is control.
It has worked for many years, for many centuries.
Yeah. The Soviet Union expanded that by controlling the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. Again, you expand your markets. That parasitical model requires you to constantly, let's say, coerce your markets into being your allies. That's why we see Orban and others. That's why these puppets work particularly well, because they can't, trade with free nations. They can't trade with those who could withdraw, the desire to trade with them. They have to have, let's say, captured markets for that model to keep working, and they have to expand. That, I think, is the real existential threat to Russia, as they saw via Ukraine, which is losing their dependent markets. And then, democracy threatens the whole extraction, distribution model, the whole sort of parasitical hierarchy. It threatens every level of that.
And that's where Ukraine plays such an important part, because it literally proves that it doesn't always work like that. So exactly, I think, this is where all this politicking and the wars that are happening just kind of puts things in perspective, because there are certain people who, for some reason, want security guarantees from the United States. And I go, I've been saying for months, like, are you serious? But now it seems more and more real that Ukraine, with its expertise in drone technology, is the leader in drone warfare in the world. And again, I mean, I think it's leverage Ukraine needs to use. But either
Ukraine
way,
needs to
it's
offer NATO security guarantees, needs to offer Europe security guarantees. Everything has flipped. Unfortunately, the sort of hubristic, myopic politicians sort of partially realize, but their hubris prevents them from fully internalizing that idea. The news came out today that France and Germany in particular, but many European governments, are opposing a fast track of Ukrainian membership to the EU. And it's like, these guys seem desperate to sign their own death warrants, quite literally. Europe is entirely dependent on Ukraine for its defense at this point. If it wasn't for Ukrainians shedding their blood, as Garry Kasparov says, Europe would be overrun, and they would not have the same proportion of their population charging towards the fight, but they would have a majority of their populations running the other way towards Portugal and Spain to get as far away as possible. I think they just don't realize how extraordinarily weak they are and how absolutely dependent on Ukrainian innovation and bravery they are.
Well, and it's a combination, because it's a two-way street, because I feel like sometimes Ukrainians may feel that they are in a just fight and the world needs to support them because it is a just thing to do. But they sometimes don't, and then they appreciate all the talk about being resilient, although they don't want to be called resilient.
They don't
just
want to be
want some
resilient.
help. Right.
It's when you're here on the ground, it's actually different. I mean, most Ukrainians don't walk around going, the West is dependent on us, because there's a deep sense of humility. And this is what I always found ironic about.
And that's what I'm talking about. I keep trying to find that deep sense of humility that Ukrainians have, because I don't think it's necessarily helping.
No, it's not helping. It's not helping their cause, but it also adds a kind of authenticity here. And I always wondered about this, because humility is, don't take this the wrong way, but humility is not a quality that is generally associated with most Russians I've met in my life. The Soviet culture, which inherited part of the Tsarist imperialism, and after they kind of decapitate their middle class and their intellectual class, I suspect there would have been a lot more gentility and humility in that class, but not necessarily. But I kind of suspect. But there's a certain absolute sort of hubris about the ethnic Russian architecture of the Soviet Empire. I think it essentially came from the fact that you've entirely destroyed your intellectual class and your ruling class. And what you then do is you fill the gap, you fill your cities. I mean, in that Soviet period, I don't think people quite realize the extent, and this didn't happen in Ukraine. When you shift out your entire, educated middle class, you then shipped in peasants to occupy all the buildings and to rapidly try to educate them up to become that next sort of functional class. But that also comes with a sense of inferiority. That doesn't come with any of the sort of, I would say, sort of cultural sophistication. So you get this extraordinary arrogance that almost comes out of, a systemic imposter syndrome combined with a sort of arrogance of empire. But Ukrainians have an extraordinary humility, which I think is traditionally associated with the idea of orthodoxy. Whereas I always wondered, Russia calls itself Russian Orthodox, but there's none of the characteristics that supposedly form the core identity of that religion, which is, but it doesn't do them a huge favors. And most Ukrainians don't walk around going, we're saving Europe. They kind of know that. but they don't expect Europe to give stuff and own stuff to them. In fact, most Ukrainians are surprised, especially ones on the front who don't necessarily speak English and whatever. They're endlessly surprised that foreigners are paying attention or coming over and volunteering or crowdsourcing drones or trucks. So I work with a lot of charities, and when they deliver the stuff that we've crowdsourced, they said they're always the people who receive them ask, well, who paid for this? Where did it come from? And when it's explained to them that this is foreign volunteers who are have absolute empathy and support, they're usually blown away, and they're extraordinarily surprised because they think they're fighting on their own. They think they're doing this because they have to, and because no one else is going to do it and no one else has got their back. That makes it even more selfless and remarkable, the sacrifice they're willing to make if they just don't have any concept that the cavalry is coming to help or that anyone else has got their back. I just find that extraordinary.
Truly. We have a viewer, Evan, who writes, Russians have an arrogance that stems from a fear of inferiority.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, unfortunately, and I think it comes as it's centuries old, and obviously the Mongol occupation has a big role to play in that, but also, you know, trying to idolize or be the inheritor of Byzantium, and quite clearly not matching up to the let's say the civilizational standards of that, such as they were, but also then trying after Peter the Great, trying to emulate and copy, you know, high European culture. That must have come with an extraordinary sense of inferiority. Rather than trying to develop an indigenous culture, this extraordinary propensity to kind of acquire, copy, you know, an external culture, that creates a real imbalance, you know, and a real sense of superiority and inferiority at the same time. This sort of horrible kind of mixture.
It is, and I'm thinking that one of the greatest claims to fame of Russia, Russian nesting doll, is actually Japanese. But then, on the other hand, you know, possibly the greatest contribution to art world is a Ukrainian song, and most people don't know it, which is Shedrik. So.
And there's Korkmaz. I mean, Mikhail.
You know, you can steal other people's things and call them, you know, your own, and promote your great culture, or you can create great things and nobody even notices that you did it, and it's just great.
Yeah, I mean, this is a real one of the real problems. I think is that also because Russia had a structure, an extraction structure, and, you know, sitting on vast natural resources, as the writer Alexander Etkin sort of points out, that, you know, the modern version of that is oil and gas. But if you go back to sort of Peter the Great's time in the late medieval period, you've got this extraordinary, you've got water, wood, fish stocks, you've got furs and pelts, but it's also quite parasitical. It's also quite extractive. And it already built that sort of model we're talking about earlier of requiring a sort of, you know, you don't need a huge capitalist system, a complex system. You need to maybe tolerate a small class of traders, but generally most of your population is kind of surplus requirements. All you need to do is to control those trade routes, and, you know, have enough of a leverage over the end markets to keep that model going. And it's not new, and it's not invented by the Soviet Union. It's centuries old, and there's no real incentive to develop the mechanics of production, added value, and all these things would give rise to, you know, rule of law, contract law, more of a sort of, you know, relationships based on trust, because complex manufacturing processes require, you know, more complex institutions, education, all this kind of stuff. it's remained a fairly parasitical model that's never had any need to develop that robust rule of law. And then when the oligarchs came along in the 90s, as Oliver Bullough and others have pointed out, actually the worst thing the West did was to allow the Russian ruling class to benefit from external rule of law by exporting their money abroad. It gave them no incentive to create institutions around rule of law within their own country. It's as they had these by proxy. We guaranteed their ill-gotten gains by allowing them to export that to the West.
There's a couple of things that I'd want to add to that. First of all, I think that sometimes it's hard for us to grasp to what extent Russia looks at anything as a commodity. And I feel like I was a commodity myself, because Soviet Jews were exchanged for, I think, like oil equipment that was needed for oil exploration or whatever else. But there were other reasons why Soviet Jews were allowed to leave, had nothing to do with humanitarian reasons or ethics or anything. Commodity, or Russian children or Russian women. And the most useless, I thought, Russian commodity was Russian men, because nobody wanted those.
No, that's not. There's no market for that.
No, but it turned out that they're needed as cannon fodder. And that's apparently their service, their purpose is when there's too many of them, that they just get shoved into the machine of war. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, and that's part of the misunderstanding with Russia, is that, of course, it's a very ineffective resource commodities-based economy. And so when you look at Russian ratings economically, you see that it's quite a weak little country that's like maybe like Italy or something. But when you think about how
far smaller than Italy. I mean, and Italy, of course, in the north has an extremely complex manufacturing based economy in the top half of the country. I think people forget.
I did not want to insult Italy. I'm sorry. My apologies to all Italians. Whatever the smaller country, I don't know, maybe Portugal, I think, whatever.
Yeah. In terms of size, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. But it's all about how you spend the money, because if you're going to use the resources to try to improve life of people in Russia, well, you don't have enough. But if this is all done to benefit life of very few people, and the army of people with sticks that are going to stand around and protect them, well, you just might have enough money for that.
You have enough for that.
And like if you want to use it for corruption of politicians across the world, there's money for that. It's just where you choose to spend it.
As a conversation I had the other day is, it's absolutely unsurprising but telling that there are 400,000 Rosgvardia to protect the personage of Vladimir Putin. Has he sent any of those to the front? Oh, hell no, absolutely not. And probably, God, hundreds of thousands of secret police, hundreds of thousands of internal FSB officers in that Siloviki class.
Yeah, we truly don't know the size of KGB or FSB. How many people are actually working there? How many people are on staff? How many people are in active reserve? It's a huge organization that sounds like an army size as well.
And that doesn't include all their assets and agents and informers
and wives and mistresses and yes.
Yeah, I mean, every industry, this is going to surprise people maybe, but every major company, every major enterprise, every major media organization will have a whole ton of FSB plants. You can kind of guarantee that at the top of any profession, there will be talented people who have sold their souls to the devil. There'll be mediocre people who've made it into top positions because they have made their accommodation with the Secret Service. In fact, you can pretty much guarantee that anyone that is either professionally or financially successful will have made some form of accommodation with the intelligence services potentially to do what they're told when they're asked to, to call in favors and or to snitch on their fellow professionals.
Yes, I mean, Russia is going to be Russia.
Most people think this went away in the 1990s. Like, how could that still be the case now? I think a lot of people don't realize the extent to which that process of the FSB or KGB retaking the economy, retaking the means of production, the means of influence, that process was proceeding apace from 1996 onwards. And then Putin was just the culmination of a process of internal state capture, which had already been going on for a number of years. He wasn't the instigator of that. He was their crowning achievement. He was their signal that they'd won and that their people were now in place everywhere, ready to conduct essentially an internal coup.
We have a viewer in Russian who is commenting, it's curious who during our time, in our days, can give any sort of guarantees. It sounds like a fairy tale. And I will comment on that it's not about guarantees of safety. It's about trust. It's about guarantee of trust is all we can create here, and that's all we can rely on. And in my opinion, trust is actually better than safety, because safety can come and go, but trust is something that remains and can be built on. And I think that I trust that we'll be back with our podcast to talk about this next week.
I trust that we will. Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll make it back.
Jonathan, thank you to you, and thank you for your work that you're doing. I'm looking forward to the videos you're going to produce from this trip.
I ironically I haven't done any interviews really this trip. I know.
What is this, a vacation?
I've still got a bunch of interviews from the trip a few weeks ago, so that's the good news. I'm probably only done 1 or 2 interviews this trip, because it was mainly working on the documentary and going out and looking at stuff and learning. But there are a few interviews from the last trip which hopefully people will appreciate. And our series of interviews with leading Ukrainian cultural figures, we're firing it up again. I won't give the details just yet, but in April, we're going to be relaunching, and hopefully every day in April, we'll be doing major interviews with leading Ukrainian cultural figures, and they will nominate their favorite works of film, literature, and art. We will build that list of recommendations. I'll be working on a Substack article which will list them out with additional details. So April is going to be a sort of major, I would say, cultural event on Silicon Curtain.
Looking forward to that. And I'll just say, follow me on Substack, because it would be nice to get 100 free subscribers.
Yeah.
You're listening and watching Rashkin Reporter's Silicon Curtain. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.